Well, good morning, everyone. It's an extraordinary day, and I'm grateful for your presence this morning. Thank you to the Chapmans who made possible the way that we partook of communion this morning, and thank you to the servers who handled that change very well. Really do appreciate that. So, it's been an extraordinary couple of days. And so this morning I want to talk about the opportunities of what it means to live in this kind of extraordinary moment. The first day of the week has always been marked for Christians as the day that Jesus was raised from the dead. It is Resurrection Day, and it has been marked out by the apostles' example as the day that we should gather to break bread, Acts 20 verse 7, and that we gather to fund the work God has given us as a church and make collections, as we've done, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. It is the time to devote ourselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer, Acts chapter 2, verse 42. This is the Lord's day, and let us rejoice and be glad in it. However, as we work through the unprecedented time together, the challenges created by the coronavirus pandemic have moved your elders to respond this way to make this extraordinary Lord's Day feasible. And in the same process, it has given me opportunities to consider again about what this episode of extraordinary pandemic should show us as Christians. Pandemics are not unusual. They've happened all through time. And I want you to look first in the book of Leviticus. We're going to look at Leviticus 13 first. The things that we should see about today is the first point I want to draw from the law of Moses. Oftentimes, the law of Moses gets a bad rap because of how we view it. You have to work perfectly under the law of Moses, therefore that's the only way you can be righteous, Galatians 2. Or it only burdens the transgressor with the knowledge of their sin and guilt, therefore why should we bother to read it? Yet what we find in it actually is the wisdom of God. And in that law for the nation of Israel, were many aspects where he illustrated to the nation his own wisdom, a wisdom that they did not fully comprehend, but through centuries of time we've learned to appreciate the value of the things that God instructed them. One such case is found in Leviticus 13. Read with me verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, when a man has on the skin of his body a swelling or a scab or a bright spot, and it becomes an infection of leprosy on the skin of his body, then he will be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of the sons of the priests. And the priest shall look at the mark on the skin of the body, and if the hair in the infection has turned white and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is an infection of leprosy, and the priest has looked at him, he will pronounce him unclean. Then it goes on with other more specific reading about how to deal with different aspects of leprosy. Leprosy, which today is not nearly as rampant, certainly in our experience, but it's still something that gives us insight to what is truly wisdom from God. Because when you and I use the word quarantine, that word's not found in Leviticus 13. But the medical procedure of quarantine all grew from these kind of experiences where ancients were taught things medically. So when God was giving them instruction about how to deal with this leprosy, he was giving them instructions because of his understanding of the people that he had created. The practice of isolation and confinement were processes within quarantine. Even today, our modern social distance terminology are methods by which we are trying to implement the wisdom of God in Leviticus 13. While not everything is leprosy, the application of what quarantine practices are originate with the law of Moses. You can go through and you can search historically. And every medical record will say that Leviticus 13 is the first written record of these medical practices that in many ways has saved humanity from the time of Christ. Hansen's disease, which is what we call leprosy today, is evidence of what God saw his need to help the people with. So when these practices of quarantine became applied in 551 in the Common Era, the plague of Justinian or bubonic plague killed many, many, many people. But as people began to implement what Leviticus 13 was teaching, people were saved. In the middle of the 14th century, repeated waves of the Black Death swept across Europe, killing thousands of people. But when the implementation of these quarantine methods were put in place, people were saved. But I want you to think about what it is that God is doing. While it is true that leprosy is oftentimes paralleled to sin, leprosy is not sin. We draw parallels to all sorts of things, but we need to understand that while an offering for sin would have been offered by many people who were unclean, God was not trying to teach them that that particular disease or event in their life, making them unclean, made them a sinner. But it was the recurring reality of the fact that we live in a sinful world. And whatever the disease is a cause of sin. Whatever the disease is. When you get the common cold, it's because of sin. We live in a sinful world. When you get cancer, it is because of sin. We live in a sinful world. You may not be personally sinful that caused that disease to come to your body, but you live in an environment that is sinful. We are separated from the tree of life. We are outside of Eden, the garden. And God has placed us in this environment because of the sin of Adam and Eve. We live in this environment because of sin. And we can't find our way out of it. So God's law, through Moses' instructions to the nation, was bit by bit to help them live their lives in spite of the environment in which they were. And in giving this quarantine instruction, I want you to notice some important things. Number one, when the person was quarantined, they were prohibited from worshiping God. The very acts of worship that God had commanded of every Israelite, if they were if they were infected with leprosy, they could not worship. In fact, there were other things under the Old Testament law which quantified you to be unclean if you touched a dead body. And if you touched a dead body, you were prohibited from worshiping God with his other people. I want you to notice how God made this point. That when you come before me, you are to be clean. And he did not punish the people who did not come to worship, even though he had commanded them to worship. He gave them clear instructions to protect the community from infection, particularly as it related to leprosy. Number two, not only could they not worship, an unclean person could not tithe. An unclean person had to celebrate the Passover a month later, Numbers chapter 9. That God was forever making amendations to what was happening because they lived in a sinful world to accommodate them to accomplish what it is God needed them to do. So you and I should take that as wisdom from God. Just like our elders today have made this decision to help reduce exposure in the potentiality that our government has placed upon us of a pandemic. As long as they had the disease in Leviticus 13, they could not worship. God's knowledge of his world, God's knowledge of his people showed his wisdom. So you and I should understand that today, while in the ancient world of Leviticus 13, it was the priest acting like the medical community to determine if someone was a leper or not. There were other cases where uncleanness could only be identified by the person themselves. But as it related to leprosy, only the priest could declare you clean. And so God required the priest to make those decisions, giving all of these articulate, very mind-numbing, and often probably for some people, stomach-turning details about leprosy. The priest had to make a decision. Do you think everyone agreed with what the priest's decision was? Oh, he didn't look close enough. Oh, that hair was whiter than that. But God put into motion this wise way of dealing with it and did not expect his people to argue with it. Because someone had to be in charge to take care of the needs of the community. And in our own cultures that we now live in, we have people who are in charge of informing and trying to protect us. Not in a religious sense, but in a medical sense. Let's let them do their jobs. And your elders are trying to do the very same thing, in shepherding the flock and doing the same. So not only can we see from this extraordinary day that if it had not been for God's wisdom to Israel in Leviticus 13, today would we have even known anything about quarantine to protect people from the onslaught of any kind of disease. Number two, what this extraordinary day teaches us is the value of worship. Many of you came because you couldn't think of being anywhere else. It didn't really matter to you what the danger was, but for you, you wanted to be here. We gather on the first day because it is the day Jesus called us to remember him. But what we do today is a whole lot like what they did in the first century, except they met at nighttime. And they didn't have Bible classes. And they didn't have 2 servings of the communion or gatherings on a Sunday. They gathered together to meet. The advent in our culture of Bible classes, Sunday nights, Wednesday night, midweek meeting, prayer meetings, those are advents of a modern world. They are not unauthorized. They are certainly permitted in the way God instructs churches to act. But we need to have clarity to understand that the value of what we are as a church is to remember this day, to remember this moment, and to recognize this is what God has called us together to do together. To remember Jesus, not to remember ourselves. To remember his great love, not our national security. To remember the expanse of his wonderful scheme of redemption, and not to tell the great story of our democracy. This is why we are here. And third, Leviticus 13 teaches us something else. Just as God gave permission to the unclean to worship 40 days, 30 days, depending on what it ended up being, later than their infection, God showed the importance of worship by showing them that they could worship 30 days, 40 days later. Because this is why we have come. Don't miss the point. I'm not saying like that favorite preacher joke where there's this long line of people after this man dies. He lands in this long line and he's standing at the gate to get into heaven. And they're all sitting there twiddling their thumbs wondering, okay, of course the joke will say St. Peter. What's St. Peter doing up there? And then suddenly this contagion of excitement starts to build at the front of the line, and you see this wave of excitement coming down the line, all the people talking. And as the man is sitting there, he's saying, well, what's going on? What's happening? And then as the wave of excitement arrives at the man's position, everyone says, Wednesday nights don't count. With God, they don't. You telling your wife, I love you today, may not count in the long term of life. But ask your wife if it counts. As a Christian, everything that we do together as a church, the elders have provided for our benefit. And so, yes, I'm telling you, I want you to come to Bible classes when you can. But this is the value of what we've come to do. And then the third point is the value of what Leviticus 13 teaches us. The value of persons. While Numbers chapter 5 instructs the Israelites to move the infected people out of the community, what that action teaches is that God saw the value of the community of protecting those persons. But God did not say, burn the victims of leprosy. He said, burn their clothes and give them new clothes when they're clean. That there was not one person in all of that environment that God did not consider unimportant. He considered the people who were clean important, and he considered the people who were unclean important. That it didn't matter what we thought as an Israelite. It didn't matter what we thought was the best way to conduct business. But for God, God saw the protection of the community and the protection of those individuals. Because you can be assured that every one of those people who had leprosy were in fear of their lives. Not only from the leprosy, because they didn't know what it would turn out to be, but in fear of the people who would want them dead so that they would not infect them. God cared about them too. And so in this day of extraordinary experience, I want you to remember the value of God's wisdom. I want you to remember the value of worship and how God sees the value of persons. Because God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Jesus died for everyone. And that means he died for you and each and every person in our community. Because that's the God that we serve. Thank you very much for listening. In a moment, we're going to sing a song of invitation. If this morning you need to become a Christian, we encourage you to do just that as together we stand and as we sing.